So Jeremy Wright is the Conservative MP for Kenilworth and Southam. I'm delighted we can speak to him this morning. Good morning, Sir Jeremy.
Good morning, Phil.
Appreciate you coming on this morning. I'm not sure whether you got to see any of Boris Johnson's evidence yourself yesterday. What did you make of it?
I only saw clips, but I appreciate how very difficult this is going to be for everybody who, like Cathy, was involved as a professional trying to deal with the consequences of the pandemic, or, of course, who lost someone in the pandemic. I thought that Boris Johnson's tone was right yesterday. I think, frankly, if he'd adopted that kind of tone throughout his premiership, we'd be better off. I think that he was prepared to respond at least to some of the difficult questions. He's going to get a lot more today. But in the end, this report that the inquiry will produce has to be a balanced assessment of all the things that happened. And it has to be an assessment of whether government dealt with the extraordinarily difficult circumstances it was facing in the right ways. But I think one of the things we've got to do is wait, difficult though I know this is, for that balanced assessment at the end. It's very difficult to make judgments in the middle of an inquiry like this.
And it is, we know, set to run for at least another couple of years. Yet there is a concern, Sir Jeremy, that actually the inquiry is not at the moment doing what it was probably set up to do. The point of the inquiry was to find out, wasn't it, how we responded to the pandemic, what lessons we can learn to make sure we're better prepared next time. It appears like it's more to do with the tittle-tattle of who used what bad language on what WhatsApp group right now, doesn't it?
Well, I can understand people would feel like that. And as you say, it's got some considerable distance to run yet. So, as I say, difficult though it is, I think we have to be patient for that balanced assessment that we're expecting it to provide. If I'm entirely honest, I have huge respect for Heather Hallett. I think the way she'll manage this will be extremely professional and effective. I don't think I would have allowed the televisation of this blow by blow, because I think what that does is it encourages all the things you've just described. I think a lot of the people who've given evidence over the last few weeks have had a position to defend and a reputation to defend. And that's going to have a bearing on the way they present themselves. But I think we have to trust the process. I think it's actually really important to remember that this is a process that not every country would have set up, and not every country's leaders or former leaders would subject themselves to. It's a good thing that we're doing this. It's so important to learn the lessons. So important that someone objective takes a look at it carefully, and takes the time to listen to everybody who's been involved at very senior levels. And I'm pleased to see people who were involved at senior levels being prepared to participate. That's important for the integrity of the process. Doesn't make it any less difficult for us all to hear, especially those who've lost someone who had very difficult times in that period. But I think it's a really important process. It's a good thing that we're doing it, and we have to, I think, wait and see what its conclusions are at the end.
You mentioned Justice Hallett, of course, is chairing the inquiry. I just wondered, and it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to speak to you this morning and get you on, Sir Jeremy, as a former Attorney General yourself, Chief Legal Advisor to the government. What do you make of the way Hugo Keith, King's Counsel, is performing and questioning at the moment? You've got some of the bereaved family saying he's not going far enough to try and get answers and hold the Dominic Cummings, the Matt Hancocks, the Boris Johnsons to account. On the other hand, a lot of the parliamentary writers are saying, he's becoming very much the star of this inquiry, and it's his line of questioning that's getting some of the answers that people want.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, if you televise proceedings like this, then the people who participate become very famous and people pay attention to their style. I think it's important to make a distinction between an inquiry of this kind and a criminal trial. In a criminal trial, you're trying to get to a point where you decide whether someone has committed an offence or not. This inquiry is trying to get to the truth. It's trying to understand what happened during the COVID period, and it's trying to understand whether decisions that were taken were the best they could have been in the circumstances. And I think everybody will recognise, I'm sure, that any government faced with something like this, where it doesn't have all the facts it would like, was always going to struggle to make the most perfect decisions when looked at with the benefit of hindsight. And what I hope and expect is that this inquiry will look at how things were done, suggest ways in which they could have been done better, but also recognise that it was never going to be perfect. I think it's impossible, actually, for many of us to imagine just how difficult it was to be in government at that time, having to make hugely significant decisions against a background of very considerable ignorance. Some they got right, some they got wrong. And I suspect the inquiry will set that out with some clarity at the end. But I think we have to remember that those people didn't know very much more than the rest of us about this condition. And the inquiry will have to decide whether, based on the facts they had, they made the right calls. Plus, they'll have to look at whether the science was right and all the rest of it. So it's a really difficult judgment for people at the time to have made. The inquiry will have to assess it against the backdrop of what they could have done better.
Just while I've got you on, Sir Jeremy, must get your reaction to the government's proposed policy on illegal immigration, the Rwanda bill. We've seen the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, resign only last night. It appears again to be tearing the Conservative Party in the Commons apart, doesn't it? Is the Rwanda bill now doomed?
Well, as you will know, I take the unfashionable view that you ought to read something before commenting on it, and I haven't seen this bill yet, so I want to have a read before I decide whether it's good or bad. What I will say is Robert Jenrick was a good and competent minister. He's a loss to the government. I'm sorry to see him go. But this issue is incredibly difficult. There is no way, I'm afraid, of producing an easy answer to the problem that we face in illegal immigration. And so the government is struggling to get this right. I think a component of that strategy has got to be to set a clear deterrent for those who wish to abuse our systems and come across pretending to be something they're not on a small boat, which is, by the way, extraordinarily dangerous for them and for everyone else with them. We have to deter that. And I think saying that you could sensibly process asylum claims in a third safe country is a reasonable principle. Whether Rwanda's the right place is another question, but the idea of doing that is a reasonable one. But that's not the whole answer. And I think it's important we don't get distracted with one particular component of an illegal immigration strategy when there's lots more you could be doing. And indeed we are doing. And actually you can see the numbers starting to come down, not because we're sending people to Rwanda, but because we're cooperating properly with the French. We're stopping people getting on the boats in the first place. And we're doing all the other things that a sensible strategy requires. So one of the dangers here is that we get, I'm afraid, hugely het up about a very small percentage of the overall answer when you have to do lots of things at once, which you very often do in government.
So, Jeremy, always good to speak to you. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Conservative MP for Kenilworth and Southam, Sir Jeremy Wright, with us this morning.